While launching his insidious invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, Russia's President Vladimir Putin called out the Ukrainian government and said he will strive for
И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
To most of us around the world, hearing a democratically elected government being called neonazis sounded absolutely ridiculous, and we dismissed it as a byline of war propaganda and rhetoric. But in his later announcements since that fateful day, Putin and his cabal has repeatedly stuck to that rhetoric and used the term neo-Nazis multiple times. So what is going on here? How can a leader like Putin think that the world would believe what he is saying? Where is the source of this narrative thread coming from? Welcome to Bite Size Defense, and today we will take a quick look at the history behind this extraordinary claim made by Putin to justify his invasion of Ukraine. Before I begin, let's get a caveat straight in. I realize this is a sensitive topic and that in the current situation it is going to ruffle some feathers. On my part, I'm not trying to argue anything here, just trying to present historical facts as is. With that being said, let's get into it. Outside observers do not generally tend to associate Central and Eastern European countries with right-wing extremism now, because these forces are latent and in some cases have become quite obscure as well in the last decade. But the far-right element has always existed in the politics of these countries in some form or the other since World War II and even before. The period between the 80s and the mid-90s again saw the rise of many such radical nationalistic right-wing leaders and parties all over the former Soviet bloc countries. These were the days of Gorbachev's perestroika, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union that followed sparked huge conflicts in these post-Warsaw Pact countries, mostly along ethnic lines. In fact, many of these ultra-nationalist leaders and political parties that emerged out of this decade-long conflict still hold political positions today, although most of them have since moderated their stance and tried to assimilate themselves into the new centrist political order of Europe, and Ukraine is no different in this regard. Ukraine's brush with fascist ideology started way back in the interwar periods between World War I and II, with the formation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Their main goal was Ukrainian statehood and a release from the Bolsheviks who had ruled the country since the October Revolution of 1917. During the Second World War, a radical section of the organization, led by Stefan Bandera, colluded with the Nazis, and its paramilitary wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, carried out large-scale ethnic cleansing of Polish people in fear of them re-establishing their pre-war borders. Although the group quickly fell out of favor with the Nazis during the war itself and fought against them as well as the Soviets, their policy of massacring and expelling the Polish population that lasted till 1944 was one of the worst in the war. An estimated 100,000 Polish civilians and an unknown number of Ukrainian civilians in the Volhynia and Chelm region in the northwest of Ukraine fell victim to this ethnic cleansing. Bandera and his OUN is still controversial in Ukraine today, with some hailing him as a defender of independent Ukraine in those dark days, while others see him as an anti-Semitic fascist responsible for the most heinous of war crimes. In 2019, a law passed by Ukraine's then President Petro Poroshenko gave veteran status to those who fought in the OUN army during World War II. But surely this is not what Putin is referring to when he calls for the denazification of Ukraine in 2022. Certainly not, because if you go back this far in history, even the Soviet Union under Stalin collaborated with Hitler, and Stalin's mass deportations, especially of the Crimean Tatars, killed thousands along the way. No, he is referring to something much more recent in Ukraine's past. By virtue of its geographical location, Ukraine has always struggled with racism and ethnic discrimination. When it was behind the Iron Curtain, not a whole lot was known about these differences to the wider world. But these fault lines were brought to the forefront with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the rise of various ultra-nationalist parties gaining attention in the period after that. Svoboda, which was known as the Socialist Nationalist Party of Ukraine until 2004, is probably the biggest such party still active in Ukrainian politics. It has been accused of being a neo-Nazi party by Ukrainian Jews, and while leaders from the party have a history of making anti-Semitic remarks, their rhetoric has toned down considerably over the past years in an attempt to go mainstream. Not to say that Ukraine did not struggle with issues of hate crime and racism, especially against its Jewish and Roma population, but despite those issues, most far-right organizations only existed in the fringes of Ukrainian politics for most of the first decade of the 21st century. But as Martin Luther King famously said, hate begets hate, violence begets violence. 9 years ago, when the Maidan Revolution ousted pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych and the West cheered, a terrible undercurrent of radical far-right violence was sweeping across the country. It was in fact ultra-nationalist militias of the far-right neo-Nazi organization, the Right Sector, led by Dmytro Yarosh, who took over the Maidan protests and led the climactic march on parliament that overthrew the government in mid-2014. To outside observers, this undercurrent would only become apparent in the next few years. With the war in Donbass intensifying and then with the Russian annexation of Crimea, there was a sudden surge in ultra-nationalist organizations who saw the opportunity in the conflict to fuel their own hateful ideologies. Post-Maidan Ukraine is the only nation to have legitimized neo-Nazi formations in its armed forces, the infamous Azov battalion. In all likelihood, this is what Vladimir Putin was referring to in his opening announcement on the 24th of February, before he launched the invasion of Ukraine. The Azov battalion was initially formed as a volunteer militia group out of the neo-Nazi gang Patriot of Ukraine and the Social National Assembly, another neo-Nazi radical right-wing organization that was founded during the War of Donbass in 2014. Andriy Biletsky, the gang's leader who became Azov's commander, had always had radical neo-Nazi views. In 2010, he wrote that Ukraine's mission is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led bench. It's people who are racially and socially inferior. Biletsky duly left the Azov battalion when he was elected as a deputy in Ukraine's parliament in 2014 and served till 2019. The battalion was involved in the heavy fighting at Mariupol in late 2014 and is known for its members wearing neo-Nazi and SS symbols and regalias and expressing neo-Nazi views. The group's insignia features the wolf's angel and the black sun, two of the most recognizable neo-Nazi symbols around the world. Although it was absorbed into the Ukrainian National Guard later that year, it gained immense notoriety among pro-Russian factions in eastern Ukraine and Donbass, and even the world's media due to various allegations of torture and war crimes. This rise of such right-wing elements in Ukraine since the 2014 revolution has been more widespread than just one battalion. It has spawned massive political alliances, led to pogroms against the Roma minority, rampant attacks on feminists and LGBTQ groups, book bans, and even state-sponsored glorification of Nazi collaborators. In fact, at one point in 2015, there were reports that the mayor of the Ukrainian city of Konotop in Sumy province was riding around in a car sporting the 14 words, which is a white supremacist slogan used as a rallying cry for skinheads around the world. Unfortunately, this is where Kremlin's propaganda machine is sourcing its narrative from, when it spews out these extraordinary claims of Ukraine being run by neo-Nazis committing genocide in the Donbass region. Modern Ukraine, especially after the 2019 parliamentary election, was trying hard to disassociate itself from these radical right-wing movements. At least this was reflected in their poll numbers. The major radical far-right political coalition that took part in the election, which included organizations such as the Right Sector, Government Initiative of Yarosh, National Corps, and Svoboda won no seats at the Verkhovna Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, in the 2019 elections. But history can be cruel, and it seems to be repeating itself all over again. Just as it seemed that the Ukrainians were finally ready to shed the baggage of their past and move on, war came knocking once again as Russia started to amass thousands of troops along its northern, southern, and eastern borders. Once again, in the brewing conflict, shadowy far-right leaders like Yarosh and the old guard of the Azov battalion are slowly coming out of the woodworks. And now that all-out war has broken out in Ukraine, everyone is mobilized to its defense, no matter their ideologies or past crimes. Already videos are coming out of Azov battalion soldiers dipping their bullets into pig fat that will be aimed at the Chechen fighters of the Russian army. Sadly, as this war drags on and the violence ratchets up, radicalism and hatred will win over good sense and rule-based order, emboldening those men to carry out more and more radical acts. Regrettably, this is the reality of war. For now, all Ukrainians are united in their opposition of the Russian invasion, and the rest of the world has isolated Russia. The West has already started infusing billions of dollars in sophisticated weapons into the country, and this will likely continue in the coming days. Most likely, some of these weapons will end up in the hand of those neo-Nazi forces. And if the situation worsens, the collaborations can escalate into these forces becoming full-blown proxy forces, fighting for the Western allies against the Russian invasion. If this war does turn out that way, what the fallout will be on Ukraine's future once the war ends is anyone's guess. But it is easy to imagine the destructive blowback this may cause. Just like all other wars, this too will end, and when it does, we hope that the hard-fought democratic progress made by the Ukrainians in the last decade do not go to waste due to this senseless calamity. If you would like to read up more on this topic, I have included a few links that informed my research for this video. Thank you for watching.